Commander Calix stood on the observation deck of the Imperial warship Dominion, her tall, slender form silhouetted against the vast darkness of space. Her iridescent scales shimmered in the dim light, shifting between deep purple and midnight blue as she moved. 4 golden eyes, evolutionary gifts that allowed her species to detect movement in nearly 270 degrees, narrowed as she watched the approaching human shuttle. "Diplomatic necessity," she hissed under her breath, the slit-like nostrils on her face flaring with displeasure. The Treaty of Proxima required exchange of personnel between human and Vexari forces. For 3 orbital cycles, she would host a human engineer aboard her vessel, an inconvenience she considered beneath her station. Lieutenant Jax approached with appropriate caution. "Commander, the human has docked. Shall I bring him to you?" "No," Calix said, her voice like ice crystals forming in vacuum. "Have him report to engineering. I'll inspect him when I have time to waste." 2 rotations later, Calix finally descended to engineering, partly out of duty, partly out of curiosity. She had conquered 3 rebellious systems, decimated the pirate fleets of the Cygnus Arm, and negotiated surrender terms that made admirals tremble. Yet she had never spent significant time with a human. The engineering bay doors slid open, revealing a chaotic scene. Components were scattered across workstations, and in the center stood a figure shorter and less imposing than any Vexari warrior. The human, Ethan Hayes according to his file, was elbow-deep in the propulsion manifold, humming some tuneless melody. "Human," she barked, "you will stand at attention when addressing your superior." Ethan withdrew from the machinery, wiping greasy hands on his uniform. His eyes, only 2, an evolutionary disadvantage Calix had always found disturbing, widened momentarily before he offered a casual salute. "Commander Calix, right? Your propulsion system is brilliant. I've never seen phase-shifting technology integrated so seamlessly with quantum drives." His voice held no fear, only professional enthusiasm. Calix circled him slowly, claws clicking against the metal floor. "You will address me as commander. You will maintain proper protocol. You will complete your assigned tasks without disrupting my ship's operations. Is that clear?" Ethan nodded, seemingly unperturbed by her intimidation tactics. "Crystal clear, Commander. I was just admiring your ship. The Vexari approach to engineering is fascinating, elegant but ruthless in its efficiency. Kind of like you, I guess." Her head crest flared involuntarily, a physiological response she hadn't experienced since youth. "You compare me to machinery." "It's a compliment," Ethan said, turning back to the manifold. "Both are powerful, sophisticated, and honestly pretty impressive to look at." Calix felt heat rise to her facial scales, an alien sensation she hadn't experienced in decades of military service. "I could have you ejected into space for such insolence." "You could," Ethan agreed, selecting a tool with careful precision. "But then you'd lose the best quantum engineer in 2 systems, and your efficiency ratings would drop by at least 12%. For the first time in her command, Calix found herself speechless. She turned abruptly, scales flushing an uncharacteristic bright violet. "Complete your diagnostics by next rotation. I expect a full report." Later, alone in her quarters, Calix caught her reflection in the polished surface of her war table. The violet hue still colored her normally midnight scales. She touched her face with a clawed hand, feeling unusual warmth. "Ridiculous," she muttered, but couldn't help replaying the human's words in her mind. No one had spoken to her with such casual disregard for her reputation in longer than she could remember. It was infuriating. It was refreshing. Calix straightened her command insignia and pushed the thought away. She had a warship to run. One presumptuous human would not distract her from duty, no matter how unsettlingly direct his gaze had been. 3 ship cycles had passed since the human's arrival, and Commander Calix found herself making increasingly thin excuses to visit engineering. Today, she claimed a need to inspect propulsion efficiency reports she could easily access from her command center. "Commander," Ethan greeted her without looking up from the plasma conduit he was calibrating. "Third visit this week. People might start thinking you're interested in engineering." "I am interested in the optimal function of my vessel," she replied stiffly, her secondary eyelids blinking in what her species recognized as mild agitation. "Of course," his knowing smile irritated her, or perhaps what irritated her was how it didn't irritate her enough. Calix observed his hands, so different from her own six-digited appendages with their protective scaling. His were soft, vulnerable, yet moved with surprising precision through the complex machinery. The phase harmonizer is misaligned, she noted, moving closer. Good eye, Ethan said, reaching for a calibration tool. Their hands brushed briefly, sending an unexpected current up her arm. She withdrew sharply. Your thermal regulation is inefficient, she said, masking her reaction. Humans operate at wasteful temperatures. We run hot, he agreed with another smile. It's part of our charm. Before she could formulate a suitably dismissive response, the ship lurched violently. Red alert signals flashed throughout engineering. Micrometeoroid collision, Calix assessed immediately, her warrior instincts taking over. Section 7 breach likely. Ethan was already moving, grabbing an emergency repair kit. The coolant systems for the quantum drive run through that section, if they're compromised. Catastrophic drive failure, she finished. They raced through corridors, crew members saluting hastily as their commander sprinted past. When they reached the damaged section, emergency force fields were already containing the breach, but coolant was venting rapidly. Manual override required, Calix said, assessing the damage. But the radiation levels. Ethan was already pulling on a protective suit. My species has slightly better radiation tolerance than yours. I've got this. That is incorrect. Vexari warriors can withstand. With respect, Commander, I've read the comparative physiology reports, and your scales may stop plasma rounds, but they don't block gamma radiation worth a damn. No one interrupted her, ever, yet before she could reprimand him, Ethan had slipped through the emergency field. Calix watched tensely as he worked, his movements efficient despite the danger. When the coolant flow stabilized, relief flooded her system, an emotion she rarely permitted herself in battle situations. When Ethan emerged, his face was flushed from exertion, sweat dampening his hair. Something about his disheveled appearance sent another unfamiliar sensation through her nervous system. Crisis averted, he reported, removing the protective helmet. Though I'll need to implement a more permanent fix once the radiation levels drop. You acted without authorization, she said, but her usual steel was missing from her voice. I acted to save the ship, he countered, standing unexpectedly close. Your ship, Commander. Later, in her private chambers, Calix reviewed the incident report, but found her thoughts continually drifting to the human. His quick thinking, his disregard for protocol, the strange warmth he radiated that seemed to melt something frozen within her. This is tactically unsound, she whispered to herself, closing the report. Yet for the first time in her decorated military career, Commander Calix found herself contemplating something beyond tactics and strategy. She touched her face again, feeling that now familiar warmth in her scales, and did not immediately dismiss it as weakness. The diplomatic summit on Proxima station loomed like a dark nebula on Calix's schedule. As the highest-ranking Vexari officer in the quadrant, her presence was mandatory, as was a technical advisor familiar with both species systems. Which was how Commander Calix found herself in a private shuttle with Ethan Hayes, acutely aware of his presence in the confined space. You seem tense, Commander, Ethan observed as stars streaked past the viewports. Not a fan of diplomatic functions. I prefer direct action to political maneuvering, she replied, her claws tapping rhythmically against her armrest. Words are often deployed to disguise intentions. Not always, he said. Sometimes words reveal what actions can't. She turned to find him studying her with an intensity that would have earned any Vexari officer a swift reprimand. On him, it stirred something else entirely. The summit proved as tedious as anticipated. Calix endured hours of negotiations, her patience wearing thinner with each passing moment. The only respite came when technical specifications were discussed, and Ethan spoke with an authority that commanded respect from both species. Your engineer is surprisingly competent, Admiral Vrix, a fellow Vexari, commented during a recess. Though he shows you insufficient deference, shall I have him disciplined? That won't be necessary, Calix said quickly. Humans have different protocols. His technical expertise compensates for his cultural deficiencies. When the day's sessions finally concluded, Calix retreated to her assigned quarters, only to find Ethan waiting outside her door. The integrated communication systems are malfunctioning, he explained. All the diplomatic quarters are affected, should take about 20 minutes to fix. She gestured him inside with a curt nod, watching as he accessed the room's control panel. His proximity was distracting. You defended my ideas today, he said as he worked. When Admiral Xerix dismissed the adaptive shielding proposal. Your proposal was tactically sound. His objections were politically motivated. Still, Ethan glanced over his shoulder. Thank you. The sincerity in his voice disturbed her equilibrium more than any gravitational anomaly ever had. Your gratitude is unnecessary, she said, moving closer to observe his work. I merely... He turned suddenly, and they were standing mere centimeters apart. Calix could feel the heat radiating from his skin, could see the subtle variations in his irises that her 4 eyes detected with perfect clarity. Merely what? He asked softly. What happened next defied all her tactical training. Later, she wouldn't be able to determine who moved first, only that suddenly his lips were pressed against hers in the strange human gesture she'd only read about in xenobiology texts. The reality was nothing like the clinical descriptions. Heat seemed to cascade through her entire nervous system, her scales flushing bright violet as his hands tentatively touched her face. When they finally separated, Calix felt fundamentally altered on a molecular level. That was, she began, struggling for appropriate terminology. Something I've been thinking about for weeks, Ethan admitted, his pulse visibly elevated in the vessels of his neck. Court-martial offense. Several, she agreed, her voice uncharacteristically soft. But we are not currently aboard my vessel. His smile then, part relief, part desire, broke through the last of her carefully constructed defenses. For the first time in her military career, Commander Calix surrendered. The weeks following the Proxima summit transformed Calix's precisely ordered existence into something chaotic yet exhilarating. Their relationship remained hidden, her quarters off-limits to surveillance as befitted her rank. But in private, she discovered aspects of herself previously unknown. You're smiling, Ethan observed one night, tracing the luminescent patterns on her shoulder scales. An actual smile. The crew would suffer collective cardiac failure if they witnessed it. Then it's fortunate this is for you alone, she replied, surprising herself with the admission. Their moments together were stolen between duty shifts and mission requirements, a reality of their disparate positions that Calix found increasingly frustrating. For the first time, her absolute devotion to military hierarchy felt like an impediment rather than a strength. The attack came without warning. A splinter faction of rebels, armed with stolen phase technology, breached the Dominion's outer defenses during third shift. Calix was awakened by combat alarms, Ethan still beside her. Return to engineering, she ordered, immediately shifting to commander mode as she activated her tactical systems. The drive systems must be protected. He hesitated, clearly reluctant to leave her. That's an order, Engineer Hayes, she said firmly, though she softened it by briefly pressing her forehead to his, a Vexari gesture of deep connection. The battle that followed tested even Calix's extensive combat experience. The rebels had timed their attack precisely, targeting key systems with insider knowledge. When reports came that engineering was under direct assault, Calix felt an emotion foreign to her battlefield consciousness. Fear. Not for the ship, for him. Breaking protocol, she diverted her personal guard to engineering instead of the command center. When communications with that section failed, she abandoned her post, something unthinkable in her decades of service, and headed there herself. She found carnage, 3 of her crew dead, systems sparking, and Ethan pinned down behind a barricade of equipment, exchanging fire with 2 rebels. His face was streaked with blood, red, so alien compared to her own blue, but he lived. Calix moved with the lethal efficiency that had made her name feared across 3 systems. The rebels fell before they registered her presence. You're injured, she said, kneeling beside Ethan, her voice betraying concern that would have shocked her subordinates. Tactical disagreement, he replied with strained humor, pressing a hand to his wounded side. They wanted to destroy the quantum regulators. I objected. She supported him as medical teams arrived, remaining by his side despite the ongoing battle, a choice that drew puzzled looks from her officers. Later, when the rebels had been neutralized and Ethan stabilized in medical, her second-in-command approached with uncharacteristic hesitation. "Commander, your battle decisions were unprecedented. You prioritized engineering over the command center. You left your post during active combat." "The drive systems were strategically essential," she replied coolly. "Of course, Commander," he said, not entirely convinced. Victory was achieved nonetheless. Alone with the recovering Ethan in the medical bay's private section, Calix confronted uncomfortable truths. "I compromised battle protocol," she admitted. "I made decisions based on emotional considerations." "You saved my life," Ethan said simply, taking her clawed hand in his. "I endangered others to do so." The realization troubled her warrior code. "What does that mean for us?" he asked, perceiving her conflict. Calix considered the question with the same precision she applied to tactical problems. "It means," she said finally, "that my understanding of acceptable risk has been fundamentally recalibrated." That night, her quarters became a sanctuary where rank and species ceased to matter, where Commander Calix allowed herself to be simply Calix, discovering that vulnerability with one person could be its own form of strength. The diplomatic exchange program was ending. In 7 rotations, Ethan would be reassigned to a human vessel, and the carefully constructed world they had built in private moments would collapse. Calix found the prospect physically painful, an ache in her thoracic cavity that no battlefield wound had ever rivaled. "Request an extension," Ethan suggested as they lay entwined in her quarters, the artificial night cycle casting soft shadows across her luminescent scales. "Cite technical necessities." "I've already submitted 3 extension requests," she admitted. "High Command is growing suspicious. Admiral Vrix has recommended your replacement with a Vexari engineer." "Then I'll request a permanent position. There are provisions in the treaty which would require explanation, justification." She turned to face him. "Our private arrangement would not remain private." The implications hung between them. Vexari command culture valorized strength and dominance. A commander who took a subordinate, worse, a human subordinate, as a mate would face significant challenges to her authority. "Then what?" His fingers traced the ceremonial markings on her crest. "We simply end this, return to our separate worlds." The thought was intolerable, yet she saw no tactical solution that preserved both her command and their relationship. The following days passed with increasing tension. Crew members noticed their commander's uncharacteristic distraction, the sharp edge of her orders dulled by preoccupation. 3 days before Ethan's scheduled departure, the situation crystallized. Admiral Vrix arrived unexpectedly for a routine. Calix recognized a political maneuver when she saw one. "Your performance evaluations have shown anomalies," Vrix said during a private meeting. "Your attachment to human engineering methods, your protection of their personnel, these suggest compromised judgment." "My record remains exemplary," Calix countered. "The Dominion has the highest efficiency ratings in the fleet." "Yes," Vrix agreed with dangerous pleasantness. "Engineer Hayes has certainly been influential, perhaps inappropriately so. There are rumors, Commander." Ice formed in Calix's core. "Rumors are beneath your attention, Admiral." "Not when they concern our most decorated commander." His 4 eyes narrowed. "I've arranged his immediate transfer. The human transport arrives tomorrow." Tomorrow, not 3 days. The acceleration could only be deliberate, a test of her reaction. Calix maintained her composure through sheer military discipline, but inside, something had shattered. That night, she summoned Ethan to her quarters for what should have been their final meeting. He arrived already knowing about the accelerated transfer. "They're separating us deliberately," he said, anger evident in his usually calm demeanor. "Testing your loyalty to Vexari protocol over." He hesitated. "Over you," she finished. "Over us." What followed was their most desperate coupling, an attempt to imprint each other's essence into memory before separation. Afterwards, Calix made a decision that defied all her military training. She chose happiness over duty. The next morning, when the human transport docked, the entire command crew assembled as protocol demanded. Admiral Vrix stood smugly beside her, waiting to observe her stoic acceptance of the engineered separation. Instead, Commander Calix, terror of the Cygnus Arm, conqueror of 3 systems, stepped forward and did the unthinkable. Before the assembled crews of 2 species, she placed her ceremonial blade at Admiral Vrix's feet, the Vexari symbol of challenge to authority. "I reject the false choice between personal fulfillment and professional duty," she announced, her voice carrying the same command presence that had directed fleet movements. "The Treaty of Proxima was meant to forge understanding between our species. I have gained that understanding." Silence fell, broken only when she extended her hand to Ethan in the human gesture of connection. "Engineer Hayes remains under my command," she continued, "not as a temporary exchange, but as my chosen consort and technical advisor. Any who challenge this decision challenge me directly." Her reputation made the threat clear. Even Admiral Vrix hesitated to accept her ceremonial blade. "You would sacrifice your standing for this arrangement?" he asked incredulously. "I sacrifice nothing," Calix replied. "I evolve, as must our understanding of strength and command." Ethan stepped forward, taking her offered hand despite the gasps from both crews. What followed would transform interspecies relations across the quadrant. Commander Calix, now operating with unprecedented autonomy, became the architect of a new form of diplomatic engagement. Her fearsome reputation, combined with her visible commitment to human Vexari cooperation, created a template others would eventually follow. In private moments, when command responsibilities temporarily subsided, Calix would still sometimes touch her face in wonder, feeling the warmth that one human had awakened in scales adapted for the cold calculations of space. "Still surprised?" Ethan would ask, recognizing the gesture. "Always," she would admit. For Commander Calix had conquered many systems, but surrendering her heart had proven her greatest victory.